Welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series, weekly discussions of practice and science featuring experts in behavioral health and the law. This is a series run by the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico in support with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box. You can enter those anytime you feel comfortable, but do know that we hold the questions until the end, and oftentimes it's not possible to get to all of them. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet posted in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, there will be a link that's posted in the chat box, but in the latter portions of the talk near the end. So as we get to 40, 45, 50 minutes at the top of the hour, keep your eye on the chat box for a link there. Make sure that you bookmark it if it's not working for you right now, or if you're going to open it at a later time. And make sure after you complete the survey that you save the certificate, because we don't have access to the certificates after the fact. If you missed last week's talk in the series, Dr. James Andretta's inspiring discussion of his and others' work in identifying survivors of child commercial sexual exploitation is now available on our YouTube channel. The recording for this week's talk should also be available on our YouTube channel sometime later this week, and the PowerPoint slides will be accessible for those people that are registered for this series, and those will be later in the week as well. As a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we have Dr. Christopher Bishop, who will be overviewing a framework for parental capacity evaluations. But getting back to this week, I'm excited professionally and personally to introduce you to today's speaker, who'll be discussing psycholegal considerations around the Incel movement. This is Dr. Anna Feinman. Dr. Anna Feinman is a licensed psychologist and forensic evaluator in the Community and Public Safety Psychiatry Division of the Medical University of South Carolina, where she serves on faculty as a clinical assistant professor. Dr. Feinman obtained her Bachelor of Arts degree in Psychology and Political Science, International Relations at UC Santa Barbara, then received her master's degree in Marriage and Family Therapy from the University of Southern California, and a Master's of Science degree in Clinical Psychology before getting her Ph.D. in Clinical Psychology with a forensic emphasis from Palo Alto University. She completed a predoctoral internship at Heartland Behavioral Health through the Ohio Psychology Internship. And then, where the personal part and professional part comes in, she did her forensic psychology postdoctoral fellowship here in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico. Dr. Feinman began her career as in mental health as a marriage and family therapist, working primarily with children and families. And since then, she's worked with a variety of forensic populations, both on inpatient and outpatient basis. Her clinical interests these days are in criminal and civil forensic evaluations, restoration, treatment, and risk assessment. She conducts research in the areas of extreme overvalued beliefs and supervision and training, and is just a fabulous colleague all around. So Dr. Feinman, Anna, on behalf of the University of New Mexico, we're excited to have you returning to us and thankful for you sharing your expertise with all of us today. I will go ahead and throw it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Perillo. I appreciate that introduction. So yes, today I'm going to be speaking about sort of the development of the Incel movement, some psycholegal considerations, and some clinical things as well. Skip through the brief bio, the CE information that's been given out, and the disclosures. I don't have anything to disclose. And the disclaimer that the views that are expressed in this presentation are not necessarily representative of the views of the University of New Mexico. And I'm going to move straight up to the learning objectives. My goal here is really to describe and contextualize the development of the Incel movement. I want to spend some time talking about some of the relevant concepts, some of the vocabulary, and my aim here is really, I'd like to promote recognition in psycholegal context, and I mean that clinically, I mean that in forensic context and legal context and things like that. I also want to talk about the intersection of mental health and incel extremism. And the caveat there is that I could probably spend an entire hour talking just about that. So it's going to be brief. It's going to be an introduction. Maybe if Dr. Perillo is willing to have me back, we can delve into that on a different day. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship between incel beliefs and behaviors that lead to contact with the legal system. And that's kind of going to be our hour at that point. Before I get too much farther, I would like to kind of provide a disclaimer. Some of the language, some of the pictures and diagrams and graphs include profanity, they include misogyny, they're prejudicial. And I've sort of gone back and forth thinking about how I want to present this information. And I hope to toe that line between giving you the necessary information and the appropriate information, and not kind of crossing over into anything gratuitous. So my hope here is to share the language that is used within this population, and not to offend anybody with what I'm saying. And then that last disclaimer that I have is a variability in terms. Like other sort of more nebulous online communities, there's a variability in terms, and perhaps you've heard of some that I haven't, but the ones that I am sharing here with you today are mostly concentrated in the literature that I've seen, the forums that I've encountered and spoken to me in my practice by patients and clients. So that's my disclaimer, and I'm going to go ahead and jump right in then. Okay, so I'm going to start with a definition. Incel is a noun. It is a person, usually a man, who regards himself or herself as being involuntarily celibate and typically expresses extreme resentment and hostility towards those who are sexually active. This is from Merriam-Webster. If you look at the big three dictionaries, you will see something fairly similar across the board. I've included here this photo that is directly taken from a forum. This is from the community itself. And the title of this picture is The Virgin Walk. And the idea here is that somebody who is an incel can be recognized on site. And this is some of these physical characteristics and features that these individuals will present with. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. There's some satire there. However, there's really nuggets of truth to how these individuals view themselves and view others in their community. Hopefully you're able to read that, but some of the things that it says, walks too fast, back slouched, stiff straight arms, looks below the peril. That's an important one. But notice that so many of these, and for obvious reasons, are focused on appearance and things that are have to do with that. And so I'm going to talk about common terms a little bit next, because I'll be using these common terms throughout this presentation. So on one side here, we have the chat. The definition, again, this can vary, but I'm pulling from a piece of literature that is pretty recent: an attractive man who has his way with women. And approximately 20% of the population is considered to be a Chad. This may sound like a compliment, but it's not really. And if you look at the way it's described, and this is pulled from that same sort of comparison point from the same forum, and they're talking about, again, physical characteristics: arms constantly flailing in confident, unpredictable ways, head is at a perfect vertical angle at all times. But then there's some internal stuff right on the left here. It does not register the emotions or feelings of others at all. You'll notice that the Chad has strong muscles, kind of a classically shaped jaw, things like that. There is also a beta male, which is another term, and that term refers to, it can actually refer to several things. One definition is it's a pejorative term for a male partner of an adulterous wife or girlfriend. And it's also used when discussing cuckoldry in these forums as well. And then also it can be used to identify a man who is not sufficiently masculine. I say that in quotes because they care about women's rights. And this photo is, for a while, there were, you could frequently see t-shirts. This is what a feminist looks like, but this is a celebrity of some sort, just as an example there. Okay, then we have the Stacy and the Becky. The Stacy is a vapid but beautiful woman. She pretends to play nice, but is deceitful and only will be intimate with a Chad. Again, they're frequently referencing things that have to do with appearance, but also, never works a day in her life, and things like that. It mentions up there on the top that she has countless orbiters and numerous chats blowing up her phone. Orbiters just refers to men who are interested in sleeping with her, but may never get the chance to do so. And then we've got the Becky, which is the average woman. The phrasing here is that they are contemptibly socially ambitious. And the idea is that they mislead these orbiters, like these beta men that believe that they have a chance with them while they're coveting a Chad. And, you know, I could spend an entire hour session kind of unpacking all of the problematic and kind of the bigger issues within this, but I'm going to move on because again, I'm showing these terms and I'm discussing them in the context of this incel movement so that it makes sense. And then we have normie. It's just somebody who's not celibate, a male that has sex regularly. That is not necessarily a compliment either. I just want to put that out there in this context. And then the really important term at the end, there's the manosphere. And I'm going to actually read a verbatim definition from a piece of literature that I've somehow has fallen off here, but it's in the references. A loosely related coalition of far-right and anti-feminist online communities, which includes incels, men's rights movements, pickup artist culture, and other forms of political activism in the pursuit of male hegemony. And I don't know about you, but I have not used that word hegemony in a very long time. That's just leadership or dominance, especially by one social group over others, right? And so those are sort of the terms that I will be referring to throughout this presentation. And the idea is that I've also left them in this presentation with reference points, just so you're able to go back and look them up if you need to. So the term, I'd like to talk about the original involuntary celibate. So this is a really interesting sort of evolution. Initially, this term was coined by a woman known only as Alana. She is a Canadian woman, and she started a project in the 1990s during her college years. And then the term involuntary celibacy fully entered the internet around 1993, where she began an online forum for celibate individuals to congregate and meet up. The website was titled Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project, and the idea was to provide abstinent individuals with a community. Somewhere they can express their emotions about not having a sexual partner, and maybe find some resources to improve their social skills if that's what they wanted to do. There was a resource on it called Craig's Shyness Resource Page. They talked about like neuro-linguistic programming techniques and other sort of techniques aimed at improving people's situation in life if they wanted to kind of move from involuntary celibacy to having some success with whatever sexual partner they desired. That was the idea. So that was the original involuntary celibate. And so having kind of said that, the development of the movement, right? The manosphere, like I said, is this very loosely related coalition of far-right and anti-feminism communities. It includes a lot of different folks, but it's really seen in the literature as the gateway to these misogynistic and violent worldviews. The idea is that users in the online manosphere will migrate from less radical subcultures to more radical ones, such as these incel forums that we're discussing. They become radicalized. They're encouraged to act violently towards women to achieve certain goals. And those goals can be reversing feminist gains and a kind of a return to an era when women were subservient to men, with that express aim of men achieving these sexual goals that we're discussing. So I want to talk a little bit about a few other movements because I think the context matters here as well. So the men's rights movement, the men's rights activism movement, again, it started a pretty innocuous way. It was initially about paternity leave and disproportionately high male suicide rates. It was about that expectation of men's behavior to be powerful and unemotional and traditional, and kind of aligned with that like very traditional but still problematic concept of masculinity, and problematic across the board. But in this current iteration, manospheric men's rights activism, it's frequently a euphemism for misogynistic movements, anti-feminist movements. There's some evidence that this modern MRA group, in its modern kind of evolution, is a backlash to anti-sexual violence activism. They make claims that anti-rape activism is basically just a veneer for misandry. So that's the men's rights activist movement. We also have the pickup artists, and they don't identify, actually, they don't self-identify as men's rights activists, but they have some similar chauvinistic attributes. And again, it stems from a pickup artist culture in the early 1990s. God, it feels weird to say early 1990s and 2000s, and it entered the mainstream with a book by Neil Strauss. It's a seminal work, shall we say. It's called The Game: Penetrating the Secret Society of Pickup Artists. And the idea is that it detailed these pickup artist techniques and the philosophy of pickup artists. And just the idea is to behave as an alpha or dominant male. Hyper masculinity was on a pedestal. They don't necessarily believe that men are doomed to inceldom. They believe that with elaborate training, they can coach themselves to pick up women at bars to have sex with them. And if you ever have a chance to read more in these forums about these individuals, there's, folks keep a scorecard of how many women they can use these techniques and take home, on a weekly or weekendly basis. And so that's pickup artists. Then there's men go their own way. This is characterized by a voluntary abstinence from women. Basically, the belief there is that because of feminism, men get that short end of the stick when it comes to marriage and relationships with women. They're against affirmative actions. They're against anti-domestic violence and anti-rape legislation. They believe that all of that activism is weaponized to oppress men. And this underlying belief that women are toxic to good men. And so these are all communities in that active pursuit of male hegemony, domination, and leadership. Again, kind of a trigger warning. These forums are really easily accessible if you'd like to kind of look into them some more. But they can get pretty deep pretty quick. So then to go back to incels and their space in that manosphere, they consider themselves to be a byproduct of women's empowerment. I do want to take a step back for a second and also say that the term involuntary celibates, they have really predated this modern feminist movement. For example, folks who are otherwise abled or have a condition that precludes them from conventional sexual norms, they don't have sex and can kind of present as truly involuntarily celibate. But these partners these individuals don't have partners for reasons that are not considered like a modern incel background. And they don't actively subscribe to that manospheric incel movement. And so this current manospheric incel movement that I'm talking about today, it is a mutated version of a community that once attempted to provide people who had trouble finding sexual partners with advice and a sense of belonging. And so I think if we look back at most of the roots of these movements, you'll find that that's what it initially was. And then it sort of mutated for many, many reasons, some of which I will discuss now, into what it looks like today. Okay. So this basic belief system, this unifying philosophy. Again, direct quote, because I think that this researcher puts it beautifully. Modern feminism, married to the effects of social media and online dating, has resulted in men getting the short end of the stick, leaving them sexless and lonely. And that is kind of, in a nutshell, this unifying philosophy for these folks. The idea that women are a coveted resource, but they have freedom to choose their sexual partners now, and they're going to be chasing that top 20% who's wealthy, who's attractive, who's intelligent, with the idea being that they don't necessarily match their physical compatibility. And then that idea that women are denying sex for punitive reasons. And so they're attributing men's singlehood to women's engagement in pursuing men of higher status than themselves. And I know that I've said this several times, but we can spend several more hours kind of untangling that and what that looks like. I want to briefly discuss the blue pill, red pill, black pill idea. So a blue pillar, and this comes from originally was pulled from the film The Matrix, but again, they've taken it a step further and kind of morphed into something a little bit different. So a blue pillar, the idea that they believe that the individuals who are blue pillars believe that they live in this justly equal society between men and women. They might even believe in the patriarchy and that it exists, that it has negative and harmful effects. They don't believe that women need to be manipulated in order for men to have access to sexual encounters or relationships. They don't believe that manipulation is needed to get fair access to jobs or any other special goods that manosphere users believe women are monopolizing. So a blue pillar is kind of that beginning stage for individuals that are part of the incel culture. And then the red pill. And that's why I say status quo. And then the red pill is kind of an eyes open situation. Individuals who are subscribed to the manospheric red pill ideology believe that feminism is a bad deal for men, and it leads to gynocentrism, which is that belief that society revolves around serving and pleasing women over men. And that red pill is the one that's associated with pickup artists, men go their own way, and other rights movements that live in the manosphere. So according to the red pill, the idea is that feminism makes men feeble, makes it hard for them to find partners. They advocate causes such as the annulment of the Violence Against Women Act. And again, they want to return to traditional gender norms, where women primarily hold domestic roles and kind of try to adhere to that conventional notion of femininity. More recently, the term tradwife has come up. And again, I don't have time to kind of delve into that, but that's the idea. And then kind of across the board, red pillars will disparage women as shallow and childlike, but at the same time conniving, right? And that this empowerment of these individuals, of women, is to the detriment of everyone's well-being. And so there's websites that kind of talk about how do we gain women and getting what they want and finding vulnerable women who are less likely to be feminists. And then there is the black pill, which is an incel culture sort of notion. They believe that that some men are genetically inferior to others in terms of intelligence, social prowess, sexual prowess, the way that their sex organs look, and just their bodies in general, but they're very specific about that. And the idea is that women, again, naturally gravitate towards these men who have the superior genetic material, and desiring a Chad is part of the natural order. And those on the black pill, I'm putting it in quotations, they allow that men who are not as genetically inferior as incels may fail to find long-term or romantic sexual partners, and instead get strung around as these beta orbiters who are men, again, who circle a woman in hopes of being chosen by her. The black pill philosophy, and I'm not going to quote it directly because I think that that's like an unnecessary kind of gratuitous use of profanity, but the idea is that women will only settle with non-Chads after sleeping around for several years. Their beauty's diminished, they want stability, but even then, an incel will run the risk of being cheated on or left for a Chad. And then kind of what follows is that men get screwed over in the divorce. So the takeaway here is that there's a hierarchical structure. Women are the primary culprit. And so this is an interesting point too. There haven't been that many studies of inceldom for a variety of reasons that I'll get into a little bit later, but the ones that have happened, over 70% of folks that identify as incels view their circumstances as permanent. And from a clinical perspective, hopelessness viewing circumstances as permanent is already concerning. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But some cultural considerations. So generally young white men. And that's not the whole picture. So there was a recent poll that was done, and I accessed this poll through the American Defamation League, but it was a poll from Incel.co. Again, this is not like there was no IRB. This is not necessarily going to stand up to like scientific rigor, but I think it's interesting and I think it's worth talking about because there isn't that much information out there. So this was a poll that was done in 2019 and 2020. 550 respondents that first time, 665 respondents in 2020. And almost all of them replied to about 40 questions. And the idea was to look at respondents' body types, race, ethnicity, interest in plastic surgery, and also frequency and seriousness of suicidal thoughts, which if we look back at like that idea that these circumstances don't feel changeable to folks, I think is really important. So overwhelmingly, folks are between 18 and 30, so young. The really concerning part is that some folks are under 17. And if you work with youth, or even if you don't work with youth, teenagers, folks at that age are pretty malleable. They're sponges. They can be impulsive. And again, those are broad generalizations. But that raises a red flag for me as a clinician and those around me. So roughly 55% of the respondents identified as white or Caucasian, but the remaining 45% were pretty equally divided among a range of ethnic and racial groups to include Black, Latino, Asian, Indian, Middle Eastern, and then there was an other/not sure category. When I was looking at the results, I had wondered if the other/not sure category was for folks of mixed race or whatever else. So we don't know for sure there. But in addition to representing this like array of ethnicities, it doesn't seem like incels were contained to any one country or continent. 43% of folks were from Europe, 38% North America, but then there was Central, South America, Asia, Oceania, Africa. And basically, it's really notable, I think, that every continent, aside from Antarctica, is represented. It speaks to sort of the permeation of these ideals online and globalization and things like that. And I pulled this graph. I hope you're able to see it. I pulled this graph. I don't know if it's too small on your screens, but this is a graph that kind of shows that it asks folks to select all the factors that they believe are significantly preventing them from finding a partner. Now, I think there are some operationalization issues there. Just to point out, for example, physical appearance is the biggest category. But when I think about physical appearance, hair loss and balding, height, physique, haircut, I guess, to me, that's all kind of involved there. So I wonder how that could be better differentiated. But I think that this is still a really interesting perspective to look at, and all these different things that are there. I want to direct your attention to the bottom of the graph where it says autism or similar conditions. I would, again, personally, when I was reading these results, I took that a little bit with a grain of salt. With the advent of mental health TikTok and Reels and all these other social media applications that we have access to, folks are increasingly self-diagnosing and not receiving formal diagnoses from mental health professionals. I don't have a citation for that, but just anecdotally, I know that it's happening. And so I would be pretty careful about taking that number at face value. So in conclusion, for this sort of poll, the average incel is in his mid-20s. He is of average height and he is white and European or North American. He's never had a sexual relationship or kissed a woman. He is deeply unhappy, possibly depressed, and has considered having surgery for purely aesthetic reasons. And he believes that his physical appearance is the most important element in his lack of romantic success, followed pretty closely by lack of social skills. So the incel.co folks, they posted this, these findings, and there was an overwhelming response from the community. Folks felt like they were glad someone else was struggling with these issues that they also felt. Some people were questioning the results, making some insulting statements about fake cells, which is a man whose romantic history precludes him from having incel status. For example, if somebody has had a sexual experience some folks believe that they're not truly an incel, even if they haven't had one in 10, 15, 20 years. And then, there's been, as usual, people are like, oh, trolls skewed these responses, or people are posers and things like that. But I think it's still worth looking at and seeing what it was that these individuals came up with. So I'm going to move over to violence here shortly. So the tie between extremism and violence is supported in the literature across groups. There's a lot of information out there to suggest that. And if you really look at the core of it, incel discussions on these forums, on Reddit, on 4chan, on other and I should add that frequently these groups get shut down by moderators, but they inevitably spring up very quickly again. But these discussions demonstrate pretty extremist worldviews. And when discussing kind of how to unstick society, violence is seen as the acceptable and only way. And these folks really feel like they are constantly being oppressed and abused. And the idea here is kind of to elicit this chain reaction that will lead to more and more people working together to unstick society. And the narrative is that violence is a valid solution. Men are entitled to sex and they are being denied. That is the narrative. And the idea that somebody might get hurt or killed, the idea there is that it's really negligible damage to a very powerful and glorified group. So in this case, women, especially when compared to the suffering that these folks experience frequently. So that's sort of that pathway. And I want to provide an example that is now a little bit older, but I think it's still important to the movement and how it came to be in its current iteration. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar. This is Elliot Rogers. He is the perpetrator of the May 2014 killings in Isla Vista, California. The 10-year anniversary has just passed. You may have seen it on social media. So Elliot Rogers was a student who stabbed 3 men to death and then shot and killed 3 women. He did die by suicide soon after. There's a lot of damage, structural damage. Isla Vista is a small town, left an indelible mark. But I think what's important here as well is that he's notable for this manifesto. And he wrote a manifesto that's been written and uploaded on YouTube. I have presented on Incel several times. I have yet to show this video. It is here if you'd like to watch it. Again, heads up, it's pretty dark. But the manifesto is called Elliot Rogers Retribution. And he actually sent this manifesto. I believe it was in written form, but it could have been a link to the video as well. Just minutes before he started killing, to his therapist and to his parents. There's information to suggest that his therapist initiated Tarasov duty to warn. His parents, who lived in Los Angeles, and this was in Santa Barbara, which is about 100 miles, and on a good day you can get there in 2 hours. But his parents immediately jumped in their cars separately and began driving, and the therapist called the police and did what she was supposed to do. But unfortunately, he had already started at that point. And I'm not going, like I said, I'm not going to show the video just for the sake of time. I don't think it's necessary, but I do want to read verbatim a quote from this video. I'm 22 years old and I'm still a virgin. I've never even kissed a girl. I've been through college for 2.5 years, more than that actually, and I'm still a virgin. It has been very torturous. College is the time when everyone experiences those things, such as sex and fun and pleasure. Within those years, I've had to rot in loneliness. It's not fair. You girls have never been attracted to me. I don't know why you girls aren't attracted to me, but I will punish you all for it. It's an injustice, a crime, because I don't know what you don't see in me. I'm the perfect guy, and yet you throw yourself at these obnoxious men instead of me, the supreme gentleman. So that moniker of the Supreme Gentleman has been used since that day. He's kind of been elevated to the sainthood, even above sainthood status. He's considered the Supreme Gentleman. So you'll frequently see in writings posted by other folks who perpetrated violence and were part of the incel community. But also in the literature, you'll see that Supreme Gentleman moniker, and it comes from Elliot Rodgers. He really did get elevated to a status amongst the community. And the short version is he went and he did something about it. That was the idea. So I wanted to kind of point out a few violence attacks that were inspired by Rodgers. Not sure if you're familiar with these, but they, so this is starting in 2015. Chris Harper Mercer, 9 dead, 9 injured. He was a 26-year-old student who was enrolled in a college in Rosewood, Oregon. And he fatally shot an assistant professor and some students. He also did die by suicide. And prior to, actually on the day of the shooting, he gave somebody numerous writings where it showed he had studied mass killings, including the 2014 Isla Vista shooting. He really expressed this sexual frustration as a virgin, animosity, lack of fulfillment in his isolated life. Next is Scott Beerley, also a mass shooting in Tallahassee. And again, this individual, he shot 6 women, 2 of them fatally, and he also died by suicide. And again, he posted a lot of videos starting with 2014. So for years, he had posted videos where he identified as an involuntary celibate. He complained about sexual rejections from women. He sympathized with Elliot Rodgers and talked about feeling lonely. He wrote and posted misogynistic songs on SoundCloud. He also did, and there's overlap. So he's also prejudiced in other ways. He posted videos ranting about Black Americans and illegal immigration and interracial relationships. And in those videos, he frequently referred to the Supreme Gentleman. Alec Manassian, he's it's considered a domestic terrorism attack, vehicle ramming attack that happened in 2018. He drove into a group in the business district, killing 11, injuring 15. Following that attack, though, he made a post, he made it before, but it was uncovered following that attack where he identified as an incel. And I just want to read something that he wrote on his Facebook where he said, I believe this is Facebook, Private Recruit Manassian, Infantry, wishing to speak to Sergeant 4chan, please. The incel rebellion has already begun. We will overthrow all the Chads and Stacys. All hail the Supreme Gentleman, Elliot Rodgers. So again, we're referencing the Supreme Gentleman, referencing Elliot Rodgers. So he was also actually eventually inducted into kind of a sainthood lineup. And that is just in reference to incels who fight back. And he's not quite on the same level as Elliot Rodgers just because he didn't write a manifesto. He didn't give sermons on YouTube in the same way, but frequently folks feel that he did more for the cause because he killed more people than Elliot Rodgers did. And then Jake Davidson, Plymouth, England, killed 5 people, injured 3 more, and he was very deep in the community, in the incel community, talked a lot about his virginity, expressed a lot of hatred for women, for denying them sex. So this is a study by Hoffman, and this one is a little bit older. I haven't found anything new yet. That doesn't mean it's not out there, but there's been approximately 50 violent incidents stemming from the incel movement that are documented. It would be interesting to know too, I think, how many folks did engage in violent behavior, but there's just no information about whether or not they are part of that incel community, or nothing's been posted, or we just don't know. So those are just some examples. I picked ones that I know were in the news. And it's curious to me how frequently or infrequently it's mentioned that they were part of that community. So to move on to incels and mental illness / wellness, there's some evidence to suggest that spending time on incel forums fosters poor mental health. It encourages suicide. and just overall that they're echo chambers of negativity, which I think makes sense from the literature, right? To look at some studies that have been done, there was a study that looked at both voluntary and involuntary singlehood, and there was some evidence to suggest that it predicted anxiety and insomnia and loneliness and severe depression. There's that common theme across studies of this like hopelessness and suicidality. Wrote hopelessness twice, but it is important. And the idea here is that incel radicalization takes genuine pain and suffering, loneliness, and converts it into like hatred and anger and violence. From a clinical perspective, which I hope to get into a little bit more in a little bit, the idea like where would that intervention occur? Hopefully that intervention would occur before that sadness and loneliness and pain converts into that hatred and anger and violence. But that hopelessness is a very common theme in incel-related violence. They don't see that their situation is changeable. And this hopelessness, and I'm going to get a little bit cognitive behavioral here on you, but it's exacerbated by cognitive distortions, overgeneralizations, this all or nothing thinking across multiple contexts. You know, someone said no to me, nobody will ever say yes to me ever. There's a lack of empathy, and there's a lot of justifying behaviors and thoughts and feelings and emotions to sort of then justify acts of extreme violence. In all of these attacks that we just talked about, the perpetrators misattributed this blame to women for any frustration in their life, specifically for sexual frustration, but any frustration in their life. I wanted to also say and then this is kind of personal for me. I work a lot with folks diagnosed with various schizophrenia, spectrum disorders, psychosis, things like that. As of right now, there have not been any confirmed cases of intersection of folks who are psychotic and also incels or part of that incel community. The caveat there, though, is that frequently individuals who do experience psychosis also experience impaired communication skills, which sort of make it challenging for folks to participate in a fast-paced online forum. So that's the caveat, but this is where the data is today. I briefly want to talk about incels and autism spectrum disorder. Again, all of this with a grain of salt because there hasn't been overly a lot of scientifically rigorous studies done with this. There have been some and they're wonderful, but not a ton. There was an online survey in 2021 and another sort of case history analysis that was done also in 2021. And it showed, so the first one showed about a quarter of folks identifying as incels also self-reporting autism symptoms. And then in the second study where there were the case studies, more than half showed characteristics of autism. There's also some information to suggest that Elliot Rodger, who also was diagnosed with autism, that sort of some of those symptoms significantly contributed to frustrations that he experienced. And sort of develop that personality, that way of interacting with the world, shall we say, that then ended up facilitating mass violence. But the big but here is that the rates of autism in the incel community, they mostly come from either self-report or retrospective diagnosis. Frequently, you're not going to be able to assess folks who perpetrate because they die by suicide. But there is maybe some association between having autism and those traits and being vulnerable to being radicalized as an incel, but we're not here to infer that all men with autism are at risk for inceldom or that autism causes inceldom. That's really important to note. So with that being said, right, and I have frequently, like I say this all frequently, mental illness does not necessarily mean that somebody is going to behave in a violent manner. There's a lot of literature to suggest quite the opposite. Not every individual that espouses incel beliefs or consider themselves part of the incel community or spends time on incel forums is going to engage in violent behavior. And also not every incel that is either, and not every individual that either is a part of the incel community or even perpetrates a violent act does not necessarily have a mental illness. So these are important caveats. We don't want to sort of engage in a false correlation or anything like that. But, and really this is what it comes to is this perfect cocktail of hopelessness or helplessness mixed in with challenges, with pro-social interaction, mixed into that participation in echo chamber extremist forums, and that rage that can sometimes, lead to violent behavior against self and others. And there's a lot of sometimes and occasionallys and infrequently's here, but that's sort of where we are with it. And I would like to just briefly touch on clinical considerations and legal considerations and what's next. I think that, and the literature sort of supports this, and also anecdotally speaking, when we hear that folks are hopeless, they feel that their situation's unchangeable. They feel like nothing good will ever happen and things like that. These like heavy markers of depression and things like that. That's concerning when it's mixed in with this ideology. And what on a micro level as clinicians, my hope here is that hearing this vocabulary and being provided this introduction and sort of having this as a reference point will raise a red flag about what that cocktail could potentially lead to, without necessarily blowing it out of proportion. There's other clinical considerations, I think. It's interesting that I don't frequently see individuals who espouse these beliefs as a forensic evaluator. My thoughts on that are just that I frequently see folks with severe mental illness and psychosis and things like that, and there's not a lot of overlap. I've seen this on a couple of occasions, and it's been interesting. And again, I saw depression and I saw hopelessness, and I didn't see psychosis necessarily. On legal considerations, I searched pretty far and wide. There is not very much information. There's not very much information on legal considerations out there. I am hopeful, as even in the last 2 years, there's been a significant uptick in publications related to this phenomenon in the incel culture. And I'm hoping kind of as we progress forward and as social media and forums continue to snowball this cultural phenomenon, that we'll have more information surrounding what legal considerations may or may not be helpful. And what's next? Like I said, this isn't going away. There are, scrolling through things like Instagram Reels and TikTok, you'll find that there's folks left and right espousing these types of views. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of these individuals who behave in these ways. And I hope that we're going to keep engaging in like research and practice to sort of help come up with some preventative measures. I've got references here for you that you will get from or on my slides, and here's the QR code. And that's all I have. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Dr. Feinman, Anna, on a topic that's clearly riveted the audience when you look at the sheer number of questions that we have so far. You feel free to answer any questions, attendees. If you have additional ones for Dr. Feinman, do know that it will definitely not be possible for us to get into even half of these. There are a lot of interest here. Some of it on is there data available in this particular realm, or thoughts on connections between incel thoughts and various things. Before I get into that, I do want to make sure that people do see the links in the chat box there. They are at the correct date and are working at the moment. So go ahead and bookmark that if it's not working for you right now, or copy it into a different web browser if that is something that you're interested in. So one person that kind of wanted to clarify some of these things of, talking about groups, but then also talking about these individual cases and seeing what your thoughts are on this and that. The description of the incel movement as identifying as oppressed seems that justifies violence sounds a lot like white supremacists who see civil rights progress threatening oppression. But the violence of the incel movement sounds like the acts of lone individuals, while white supremacy violence tends to be more often by groups of people. Is it correct that incel motivated violence tends to be perpetrated primarily by lone people, or are there known group acts of violence?
If there are known known acts of group violence, I have not read about them. There's some references at the end of my presentation of folks. There's one individual, I hope I say her name correctly, Dr. Sarteshi. She's been doing a lot of research, and maybe there's some mention in there, but I haven't found it. I think it would be accurate to say that for the most part, these are lone actors. And if I had to think about why that is, and this is just my own thought process, is that primary sort of feeling of loneliness. These folks are not part of big groups other than online like-minded individuals. And so I would guess that that they work in similar ways as lone wolf actors. That would be my guess.
Gotcha, thank you. So perhaps a treatment-related question. Somebody said, I've heard some incel-related or similar problematic views during my evaluations with juveniles who have sexual offense charges, adjudications. They tell me they're getting this info online, don't typically get more specific than that. What do you think are the most useful interventions to recommend to address someone with these issues or beliefs specifically? And also, what are your thoughts on recommending a man versus woman in terms of treatment providers, or how that might impact therapy?
I'm going to answer that last part first. I think that it's sort of in a similar way that we frequently try to match up folks with characteristics that they have so that they maybe feel more comfortable. I know that there's a lot of science out there on therapeutic effects of that. And I also know that in reality, it's so difficult to sometimes find in community mental health somebody that would match up. And so, for example, if a organization has 6 therapists who identify as women and 1 therapist identifies as a man, it would be difficult, I think, to give that man all of these individuals that come in espousing kind of those factors. So that's just that's my thought on like whether that's realistic or not. I don't think it would hurt, certainly. And then Dr. Pearl, could you reread that first part of that question again? I'm forgetting.
Yes. What do you think are the most useful interventions you would recommend to address these issues or beliefs specifically? Several people have asked this question of, are there recommended treatment approaches, treatment styles, or just treatment broadly, any kind of treatment recommendations that you have?
Yeah, so I did not spend a lot of time looking into treatment recommendations. I am not currently in this role that I'm in. I don't do a lot of treatment. What I did see at first glance, and I'm sure there's more to it than that, and I would actually love to learn more about it. But at first glance, what I did see is, again, using those CBT techniques in the same way that we do with any of these sort of all or nothing thinking and things like that. And then with children, there's been talk about doing like a social media detox, to call it kind of a casual. And I think that's really challenging, right? I think that it's everywhere, but frequently kids are seeing this on TikTok, and it's like a 10-second video. You see it enough times though, and it kind of becomes insidious. I know that when there were a few cases where kids were seeing Andrew Tate and other individuals espousing kind of similar beliefs. And so I would wonder about just cutting them off entirely off social media and see how that goes. But I don't know how realistic that is in the modern world.
Fair enough. And this isn't a treatment specific question, but thinking about the goals broadly, somebody referenced that you said about 70% of people in the incel movement think this is a permanent state. But is the goal, however unreachable, to only get out of the incel movement by getting into a relationship and having a sexual experience? Or is this not even held up as a name because the individuals have become so identified with the incel community?
So I think there's a spectrum. It's not, I don't think it's as black and white as that. I think that there's a spectrum. I think that there's folks who have only just kind of started and their beliefs aren't quite as fixed yet. I want to be careful to not refer to these beliefs as delusional, but they're not quite as fixed. And so you're able to kind of move them from that through treatment, from that belief of, this is unchangeable to there is potential for change in whatever direction. But I have to wonder if folks who have been part of the incel movement and have kind of had all these confirmatory experiences for whatever reason, if the challenge is just that, like, is exactly that, unless they are able to have that sexual experience they want to have, they're not going to pull away from these beliefs that they're holding. So the answer is I'm not sure, but I do think it's a spectrum. And also age makes a difference in other factors.
Yeah. And you were mentioning there that these were not delusions. We had some people asking questions of where you draw the line there. And I just wanted to direct a particular question of more in general, like, let's say you did have an attorney who was working with someone and they had concerns that these what were extreme incel beliefs were based in delusion. How would you explain the connection to delusion or lack thereof in like a competency or criminal responsibility evaluation or something like that?
Yeah, I think that it's really challenging to separate extreme overvalued beliefs from delusions. I always refer to Dr. Cunningham's Matter Rad. I think that that's a great resource for a way to conceptualize whether somebody's presentation is one thing or the other, or some strange sort of combination of both. And by strange, I mean unusual combination of both. And in practice, the challenge is really that it's not easy, and it's hard to say, especially if somebody has a history of some sort of like psychosis or psychotic behavior, but now they're on meds, but here they are still espousing this belief, and is it then overvalued? And I think the hardest thing will be coming up on the stand and testifying and having to explain that. I'm in the middle of a case right now that has that exact sort of conceptualization of like, is this an extreme overvalued belief, not related to inceldom, but a different one, or is this psychosis? And if so, how am I going to explain that when clinicians and researchers, reasonable people frequently disagree?
I remember your reports from last year where you would differentiate, value-based thoughts that were influencing someone's thoughts rather than an impairment that is causing someone's thoughts, and the differentiation there perhaps could be effective.
Right. And then the problem becomes the issue that I've run into is, okay, so the incel belief is, let's say it's a overvalued belief, let's pretend, but then this individual is talking about how all these women that are denying him sex are now also following him and doing this and this action and that action. And how do I differentiate? Because that feels like it's based in delusion, but what if it's based out of an extreme overvalued belief? And that's the challenge. And that's something that I think Dr. Cunningham addresses really well.
Excellent. Thank you. Someone's asked, the main difference with incels and other manosphere groups seems to be that incels are not for profit. This person says they study NoFap, which is a for-profit company that kind of markets hatred with coaches. Pickup artists are definitely for profit, et cetera. Do you see any efforts to monetize incels, or is that still a good distinction?
I don't know. That's such an interesting area of study. If you can find me after, I'd love to chat about it. I don't know. That's a great question. Yeah. Sorry.
Of course. Are there any standardized measures related to assessing incel thoughts, incel profile, incel risk for violence, any kind of assessment related measures or trends that you found?
I don't know of any that are specific to incels. When I was looking around to see what has been sort of conceptualized as a possibility, I think the HCR20 has been used, but again, that's like a gold standard violence risk assessment, which is excellent and likely to show some of these concerns that we might have, but it's not strictly towards incel behavior. But I think there's definitely room to explore that.
Sure. And from your understanding, how do individuals who ascribe to incel beliefs often view the option of seeking sex through, say, sex work?
It depends. So this comes not from literature. This comes anecdotally from spending some time on incel forums. I've seen multiple posts, and this is specifically Reddit before this particular forum got shut down. But that I've seen posts, actually multiple posts, where individuals will share an experience that read to them as a rejection from a sex worker. And whether that's kind of their perception of what happened, or if it actually happened that way, or what the circumstances might be, or if, for example, the sex worker felt unsafe because of the way that this individual was acting with them and had left. But there is an entire section of like folks discussing the idea of like, even a woman that I offer money to won't have sex with me. This is an anecdotal statement, but that's what I've seen.
Thank you. And of course, we have so many questions that we haven't possibly seen, let alone be able to respond. Just apologize for not addressing all of these. Just to wrap up here, what do you have any particular literature sources that you would particularly recommend if somebody wanted to learn more about incel culture?
And is my screen still sharing?
Your screen is still shared, so you could scroll back.
I'm going to scroll down. There's a few that I really enjoyed. So actually any of these are, I think, really excellent, really helpful. Something that I know as a scientist, I maybe should not be necessarily pushing, but there is a manosphere glossary on Wikipedia, which, not scientifically rigorously tested, but I think it's really helpful when you're hearing these words and you don't remember what they mean necessarily, or you're trying to figure out if someone's espousing incel beliefs. So I thought that was helpful. I thought Hoffman 2020, which is the assessing the threat of incel violence, was really helpful. And then also the Speckhard, and I hope I'm pronouncing this individual's last name right, 2021 is also wonderful. So those would be ones that I would start with. And then there's like fresh ones there's fresh literature being published on this a lot right now. So I think we can expect some excellent future information to come out.
Great. And yes, the slides will be available to those that registered for the talk sometime later this week. And of course, this information will be on the YouTube channel later this week as well. So Anna, Dr. Feinman, good to see you, of course, and thank you for sharing all of this. You have a knack for picking these issues that clearly, generate a lot of interest, a lot of these under-researched areas, and the reception has been very strong here. And thank you for all the work that you've done in trying to cohese all of this different work for us to understand incel culture that we might come in contact with. So that wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. Next week, Dr. Christopher Bishop will be discussing a framework for parental capacity evaluations. We hope to see you then for another great discussion of issues in behavioral health and the law. Until next time.